The silence felt heavier than the cast-iron skillet she'd used to make breakfast for one. Her grandson Tommy's birthday had passed 3 weeks ago. She'd sent a card with $50 inside, but never heard if he received it. Her granddaughter Sarah had graduated high school 2 months back. Margaret learned about it through a Facebook photo her neighbor showed her. "They're busy," she whispered to herself. The same excuse she'd been making for 2 years now. But busy felt different when you were 73 and your own children seemed to have forgotten you existed. The doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw a young man holding a clipboard. Another salesman, probably. She almost didn't answer, but something made her turn the lock. "Mrs. Henderson?" The man smiled warmly. "I'm David from the community center. We're starting a new program, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in volunteering." Margaret's first instinct was to say no. What could she possibly offer? Her own family didn't want her around. But David's eyes held something she hadn't seen in a long time: hope. "What kind of program?" she asked, despite herself. "We're looking for grandparents to mentor kids who don't have grandparents in their lives. Kids who need someone to listen, someone who cares." David shifted his weight. "The thing is, we have more kids signed up than volunteers. Some of these children have never had a grandparent figure." Margaret felt something stir in her chest. It wasn't quite excitement, but it wasn't the numbness she'd grown accustomed to either. "I don't know if I'd be any good at it." "That's exactly what makes someone perfect for this," David said. "The kids don't need perfect. They just need someone who shows up. Shows up. When was the last time anyone had needed her to show up?" "Can I think about it?" Margaret asked. David handed her a flyer. "Of course, but don't think too long. These kids are waiting." As she closed the door, Margaret looked at the flyer. At the bottom, in small print, were the words, "Be the answer to someone's prayer." Prayer. She hadn't prayed in months. What was the point when it felt like even God had forgotten about her? But something about those words wouldn't leave her alone. 3 days later, Margaret found herself sitting in a circle of folding chairs at the community center. 7 other volunteers had shown up, all looking as nervous as she felt. David stood in the center explaining the program. "Each of you will be paired with a child between the ages of 8 and 15, he said. "Some come from single-parent homes, others from foster care. What they all have in common is they're missing that special grandparent connection." Margaret's hands trembled slightly. What if the child didn't like her? What if she said the wrong thing? Her own grandchildren barely tolerated her awkward attempts at conversation during their brief holiday visits. "Mrs. Henderson," David called her name, and her stomach dropped. "You'll be working with Troy. He's 10 years old, loves basketball, and—" David paused, checking his notes. "He's been asking specifically for a grandmother figure. His social worker says he talks about wanting someone to teach him how to make cookies." Cookies. Margaret's specialty used to be chocolate chip cookies. She'd made them for every school event, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday when her children were young. When was the last time anyone had wanted her cookies? "Is there something wrong?" David asked, noticing her hesitation. "No," Margaret said quickly. It's been a while since anyone wanted me to teach them anything." An older man across the circle, Frank, spoke up. "My grandson lives 3 states away. Haven't seen him in 2 years. But maybe these kids will remind us why we loved being grandparents in the first place." The room fell quiet for a moment. Margaret realized she wasn't the only one carrying this particular kind of loneliness. "Troy will be here Saturday at 10, David continued. "Don't overthink it. Just be yourselves. That's what these kids need, authentic connection, not performance." As the meeting ended, Margaret approached David. "What if I mess this up? What if I'm not what he's looking for?" David smiled. "Mrs. Henderson, Troy has been in the system for 3 years. He's lived with 4 different families. What he's looking for isn't perfection. It's consistency. Someone who shows up, week after week." That word again. Shows up. Walking to her car, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. Maybe, just maybe, she had something valuable to offer after all. But as she drove home, doubt crept in. Her own grandchildren had outgrown her. What made her think she could connect with a stranger's child? Saturday felt both too far away and too soon. Saturday morning arrived with rain, matching Margaret's nervous energy. She'd spent 2 days cleaning her house and wondering if she should have bought different cookies' ingredients. What if Troy was diabetic? What if he didn't actually like cookies? At exactly 10 o'clock, David's car pulled into her driveway. Through the windshield, she could see a small figure in the passenger seat. Hood pulled up, face turned away from the house. Margaret opened her front door before they reached it. Troy was smaller than she'd expected, with serious brown eyes and shoes that looked too big for his feet. He stayed slightly behind David, studying her with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to expect too much from adults. "Troy, this is Mrs. Henderson," David said gently. "Mrs. Henderson, meet Troy." "Hi," Troy said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. "Hello, Troy. Would you like to come in? I was thinking we could make those cookies." For the first time, Troy looked directly at her. "You really know how to make cookies? From scratch?" "I do. Would you like to learn?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. He nodded. In the kitchen, Margaret had everything laid out. As she showed Troy how to measure flour, she noticed him watching her hands intently, as if memorizing every movement. "My mom used to talk about making cookies with her grandma," Troy said suddenly. "Before she got sick." Margaret's heart clenched. "What did she tell you about it?" "That it made the house smell like love." Troy mixed the butter and sugar with intense concentration. "I never knew what that meant." As the cookies baked, they sat at Margaret's kitchen table. Troy asked about the photos on her refrigerator, her own grandchildren, from years past when they still visited regularly. "Do you see them a lot?" Troy asked. Margaret hesitated. Honesty felt risky, but something about Troy's direct gaze made her choose truth. "Not as much as I'd like. They're growing up, getting busy with their own lives." Troy nodded knowingly. "Adults get busy. Foster mom says that a lot when she cancels things." When the timer rang, they pulled golden brown cookies from the oven. Troy's face lit up completely for the first time. "It does smell like love," he whispered. As David returned to pick him up, Troy carefully wrapped 6 cookies in foil. "For later," he explained. At the door, he turned back to Margaret. "Can we make something else next week?" "What would you like to make?" Margaret asked. "Anything, as long as we make it together." After they left, Margaret sat in her quiet kitchen, surrounded by the lingering smell of cookies. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel empty. Felt hopeful. But she couldn't shake Troy's words about adults getting busy and canceling things. What if she was just setting this child up for another disappointment? Over the next month, Saturday mornings became sacred. Troy arrived promptly at 10, and they'd spend 3 hours together. They made banana bread, learned to knit scarves, and worked on a puzzle of the solar system that Troy had chosen from the community center's donation box. What surprised Margaret most was how much Troy taught her. He showed her card tricks he'd learned from another foster child, explained video games with patient detail, and shared stories about school with the kind of enthusiasm she'd forgotten children possessed. "Mrs. Margaret," he said one Saturday while they worked on the puzzle, "how come your grandkids don't visit more?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been wondering the same thing, especially as she watched Troy light up with attention she freely gave. "I think maybe I stopped knowing how to connect with them as they got older," she admitted. "They have so many activities, so many friends. I felt like I was bothering them when I called." Troy looked up from sorting puzzle pieces. "Did you ask them what they wanted to do? Like, what they were actually interested in?" The simple question hit Margaret like a revelation. When had she stopped asking her grandchildren what they wanted? When had she started assuming they didn't want anything from her at all? "You know what?" Troy continued. "Maybe they think you don't want to spend time with them either. Sometimes grown-ups are weird about that stuff." That evening, after Troy left, Margaret found herself staring at her phone again. But instead of waiting for it to ring, she scrolled to her grandson Tommy's number. Her finger hovered over the call button for 10 minutes before she finally pressed it. "Grandma," Tommy sounded surprised. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, honey. I wanted to ask what you're interested in these days. What you're excited about. There was a pause. Then Tommy's voice became animated. Actually, I've been learning guitar. I wanted to tell you about it, but I thought you might think it was too loud or annoying. I'd love to hear about it, Margaret said, meaning it. Could you play something for me next time I see you? Really? You'd want to hear. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Tommy told her about school, his friends, his dreams of starting a band. When they finally hung up, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Connection. Real, genuine connection with her own grandson. The next Saturday, she shared the experience with Troy. His face broke into a huge grin. See? I told you grown-ups are weird about that stuff. Sometimes you just have to be the first one to try. But as beautiful as this breakthrough felt, Margaret sensed something deeper was happening. Something that went beyond just learning to communicate better with her family. She was beginning to remember who she used to be. Everything changed on a Tuesday in November. Margaret was grocery shopping when her phone rang. It was David from the community center, and his voice sounded strained. Mrs. Henderson, I need to let you know that Troy's situation has changed. His current foster family is moving out of state, and they can't take him with them. Margaret's heart sank. What does that mean for our Saturdays? He'll be placed with a new family, but it might not be in this area. I wanted to give you time to prepare him. This Saturday might be your last visit for a while. Margaret stood frozen in the cereal aisle. The thought of losing Troy felt like losing a piece of herself she'd just rediscovered. But worse was imagining how this news would affect him. Another adult promising consistency, only to have circumstances tear it away. Saturday came too quickly. Troy arrived with his usual small backpack, but Margaret could see the heaviness in his shoulders. David told you? He asked as soon as he walked through the door. He did. How are you feeling about it? Troy shrugged, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm used to it. It's just how things are. The resignation in his voice broke Margaret's heart. This child had learned to expect disappointment. He was protecting himself the only way he knew how. Troy, Margaret said carefully, what if I told you that just because circumstances change doesn't mean people stop caring about you? He looked at her skeptically. That's what adults say. But when you move away, you forget about people. It's easier. They made chocolate chip cookies, their first recipe together, but the usual joy felt muted. As they worked, Margaret found herself praying silently for the first time in months. Not asking for anything specific, just praying. When the cookies finished baking, Troy wrapped some in foil as always. But this time he also wrote a note and tucked it inside. What does it say? Margaret asked. Thank you for showing up, Troy read aloud. Even though I'm leaving, I'll remember that someone thought I was worth showing up for. The words hit Margaret like lightning. In that moment, she understood something profound. Her purpose wasn't just about what she could give. It was about being present, being consistent, being someone who showed up regardless of circumstances. But more than that, she realized Troy had been showing up for her too. He'd reminded her that she had value, that her presence mattered, that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. Troy, she said, her voice thick with emotion, you've taught me something incredibly important. You've reminded me that showing up isn't about perfect circumstances. It's about choosing to love people anyway. As David's car pulled away that evening, Margaret stood on her porch long after the taillights disappeared. The November air was cold, but something warm was growing in her chest. A sense of purpose she'd forgotten she possessed. 3 weeks passed with no word about Troy. Margaret threw herself into reconnecting with her own grandchildren, calling Tommy regularly and planning a weekend visit with Sarah. The conversations were awkward at first, but gradually became more natural. She also started volunteering at a local nursing home, reading to residents who had few visitors. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had felt forgotten, was now choosing to remember others. But she couldn't stop thinking about Troy. Then, on a Thursday evening, her phone rang. Unknown number. Mrs. Margaret? It's Troy. Her heart leaped. Troy, how are you? Where are you? I'm okay. I'm with a new family about an hour away. They seem nice. His voice sounded older somehow. Mrs. Margaret, I have something to tell you. What is it, honey? I've been thinking about what you said, about showing up. And I realized something. Troy paused. You didn't just show up for me on Saturdays. You showed up for yourself too. Like, you started being the person you wanted to be again. The observation was so mature, so insightful, that Margaret had to sit down. You're right, she said quietly. Spending time with you reminded me of who I used to be, who I still am, underneath all the loneliness. That's what I wanted to tell you, Troy said. My new foster mom, Mrs. Patricia, she goes to church. And last Sunday, the pastor talked about how sometimes God uses people to remind us of our purpose. He said that when we feel forgotten, it might be because we're supposed to remember someone else. Margaret felt tears forming. That's beautiful, Troy. Mrs. Margaret, I think maybe God put us together so we could both remember. You remembered that you're good at loving people. And I remembered that I'm worth loving. The profound truth of his words settled over Margaret like a warm blanket. This child, this wise, observant child, had seen something she'd missed. Troy, would it be okay if I stayed in touch? I know I can't be your Saturday grandma anymore, but maybe I could be your long-distance grandma. I was hoping you'd ask, Troy said, and she could hear his smile through the phone. Mrs. Patricia said she'd drive me to visit you sometimes if that's okay. She wants to meet the lady who taught me that love smells like chocolate chip cookies. After they hung up, Margaret sat in her quiet house, but the silence felt different now. Not empty, full. Full of purpose, full of connection, full of the kind of love that doesn't depend on proximity or perfect circumstances. She thought about Troy's words about God using people to remind us of our purpose. For months, she'd felt forgotten by everyone, including God. But maybe she hadn't been forgotten at all. Maybe she'd been positioned exactly where she needed to be, exactly when a little boy needed to learn that he was worth showing up for. And maybe, in teaching him that lesson, she'd learned it about herself. 6 months later, Margaret's house buzzed with activity. Tommy was in the kitchen, making cookies with Troy, who was visiting for the weekend. Sarah was teaching Mrs. Patricia, who had become a dear friend, how to play the card game Troy had once taught Margaret. The community center's grandparent program had grown to serve 40 children, partly because Margaret had started telling everyone she met about it. She now coordinated the program with David and had personally recruited 12 new volunteers. But the biggest change was in Margaret herself. She'd started attending the small church where Mrs. Patricia and Troy went when they visited. Last Sunday, the pastor had asked her to speak about finding purpose in unexpected places. I spent months feeling forgotten, she told the congregation. I focused so much on who wasn't calling me, who wasn't visiting, that I missed who might need me to call them, to visit them. I thought being forgotten meant I had no value. But God showed me something different through a 10-year-old boy. She'd paused, looking at Troy in the third row, beaming with pride. He showed me that purpose isn't about being needed by people who already have everything they need. Purpose is about showing up for people who need someone to show up. And sometimes, when we feel most forgotten, it's because God is positioning us to remember someone else. Now, watching her kitchen filled with laughter and the sweet chaos of cookie making, Margaret understood the full picture. Her loneliness hadn't been punishment. It had been preparation. It had softened her heart to recognize another person's need for connection. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. Mom, thank you for calling Tommy so much lately. He talks about you constantly now. We've all missed having you more involved in our lives. Margaret smiled, typing back, I've missed being involved. I'm just glad I remembered how to ask what you all actually want instead of assuming you don't want me. As the afternoon wore on, Troy pulled her aside while the others were distracted by Sarah's guitar playing. Mrs. Margaret, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you still feel forgotten sometimes? Margaret considered the question seriously. You know what, Troy? I still have moments where I feel lonely, but I don't feel forgotten anymore. Because I learned that being remembered isn't about people constantly thinking of you. It's about knowing that your life matters, that you have something valuable to give. Troy nodded thoughtfully. And you figured that out because you started remembering other people instead of waiting for them to remember you. Exactly. And you taught me that, sweetheart. You and all the other kids I've met through the program, and my own grandchildren when I started really listening to them again. As evening approached and their guests prepared to leave, Margaret stood on her porch waving goodbye. Tommy hugged her tightly before getting in his mom's car. I love our Saturday phone calls, Grandma. Don't ever stop calling me. Troy was the last to leave. As he climbed into Mrs. Patricia's car, he rolled down the window. Mrs. Margaret, same time next month. I'll be here, she called back. I'll always show up for you. I know, Troy grinned. Because that's what grandmas do. They show up. As the car disappeared down the street, Margaret remained on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft pastels. The silence that settled around her felt like a friend now, peaceful rather than empty. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for Troy or for her renewed relationships with her own grandchildren, but for the profound lesson she'd learned. Sometimes when we feel most forgotten by the world, God is reminding us that our greatest purpose might be to ensure others feel remembered. The empty chair that had once symbolized her loneliness was now filled with purpose. And tomorrow, she'd show up again, for Troy, for the children at the community center, for her own grandchildren, and for anyone else who needed someone to remember they mattered. Because that's what love does. It shows up. What lesson or insight from Margaret and Troy's story resonates most with your own life? Have you ever discovered purpose by focusing on what you can give rather than what you're not receiving?